Alrighty, so I am Vinay Gupta. I was the original launch coordinator for Ethereum. So I kind of project managed the launch. Frontier and a bunch of the other names were things that I invented. And I'm going to talk about what I've been doing since then very briefly. Yeah, I mean, that was 4 years ago, right? We've really come a long way. But there are certain barriers that we haven't been able to break through. Conceptually, we've developed enormous amounts of stuff for dealing with non-physical things, but we still haven't succeeded in getting a breakthrough into the real world. So this talk is going to be about how we use Ethereum smart contracts to control real-world assets. And this includes things like security tokens, but it also includes things like renting hotel rooms, electronic locks, and all the rest of that kind of stuff that we've talked about doing, but we haven't yet done in any kind of scaled way. So we start with the concept of Ethereum, right? It's a thing which handles the ethereal world. It's good for handling non-physical stuff. That's what it's for, that's what it's about, and it works very well for doing that. Materium, on the other hand, is for handling physical stuff, right? It's a way of using Ethereum smart contracts to control physical things. And by control physical things, what I mean is control the legal aspect of a physical thing. So the proprietary rights, the contractual rights. We're not talking about things like robots here. We're talking about the practical legal business of doing things like buying and selling houses, cars, this kind of stuff. And it all uses Ethereum smart contracts as a way of writing to the legal system. So you could think of this as almost being like the inverse of an oracle, right? An oracle reads data to the from the real world and puts it into a smart contract. This takes data from a smart contract and writes it into the real world in a way which is recognizable by legal courts as an event. A thing happens. So this gives you some sense of the sorts of applications we're talking about, right? Ethereum does things like ICOs, Materium does things like being able to buy and sell physical stuff. It's all the same technology, but it's embedded in a legal context which allows those technologies to write to the legal system. And exactly how that works is what I'm mainly going to be talking about. It's a little bit about where we are. So let's start with this basic question. Why can't I buy a house using a smart contract? And there are some sort of practical questions like, well, you know, what about the volatility of the coin you're using? We're beginning to resolve that with things like DAI. But there's a deeper problem, which is you buy and sell houses on contracts. And that contractual framework includes within it implicitly a court. Because a contract is only a contract if somebody will enforce the contract. If there's no possibility of contract enforcement, you don't really have a contract. You just have a piece of paper with some notes about what was going to happen on it. Contracts are enforceable or they're not useful. So in each contract, there is an implicit court. And the implicit court, if you don't specify it, will be the court of the country that the people who are executing the contract are in. So if we do a contract here today, it will be heard in a French court if something goes wrong. But contracts allow you to specify what legal system and what court you're going to have used in the contract. So you can specify which court system will hear the contract, but you can also specify your choice of law. So you could do weird and esoteric things, like saying that you want to use Japanese law for a contract that's signed by 2 French citizens. And the world's legal systems allow for that, because it just turns out that things like that are necessary sometimes, and so the courts allow it. This allows for institutions called arbitration courts or private courts, and these things show up all over the blockchain space. There's lots and lots and lots of discussion about using arbitration. There must be 15 or 20 blockchain startups which are discussing providing arbitration services, because what this allows you to generate is a court which actually understands, oops, a daisy, where do we go? Rats. What it allows you to generate is a court that actually understands what it is that you're doing, right? And this construct, the private court system that understands what you're doing, is necessary to provide legal enforceability to a smart contract if the smart contract isn't fully in control of all the assets on chain. So if you're doing things like an atomic swap, all of the assets are on chain, you know, Ether goes in and ERC20 contract token comes out, but there's no point at which there's a possibility for the contract to diverge from reality, because everything is on chain. It's a sealed system. When you want to come out into the real world, you could get contract disputes. You paid me Ether, I didn't give you my house. And in those situations, you need an arbitration court to come in and sort the mess out. Now, let's see. So once you think about this in the context of economic enforcement, you begin to see where the questions are in these systems. Right? Arbitration courts are not free. You have to pay these people because it is, after all, a private court, and they are damn expensive. So you go from the kind of fiat court, where your taxes are what are paying for these legal services, forward through to the arbitration court, which is a private transaction. And these things are damn expensive because the arbitrators are very high-level lawyers in most cases, and they're charging you $400 an hour for a few days of work to resolve the dispute. By the time you've had a proper arbitration that would have gone through for some mildly complex case, $25,000 of costs would not be at all surprising. If you imagine $25,000 of costs with, say, a 1% dispute rate, even if you insure the risk so it's spread out over everybody that's involved in the transactions, every user has to put money into the arbitration pot so that you've got good access to justice when something goes wrong, it's still going to cost you something like $250 a transaction. And that's unsustainable for ordinary trade. Right? It might work if you're doing sort of multi-million-dollar bond deals, but it's not going to be the kind of thing that will allow you to sell houses and cars and couches and so on. There's just too much friction. And even if you engineer that friction down, you're not going to get it to below the threshold where you could compete with something like eBay. It's just too damn expensive. Peer arbitration has been discussed a lot. There are a lot of people talk about doing peer arbitration. The problem with peer arbitration is the 1958 New York Convention on Foreign Arbitral Awards, which allows for international enforceability of arbitration. I can't believe I got all that out. This stuff is really soaked in. I have no background in law. We've learned this stuff from scratch. So I came from the smart contract world, like, okay, how do we make smart contracts handle physical stuff? This is what I have been learning for the past several years. It's how to make smart contracts do it, but it involves absorbing enormous amounts of a completely alien way of thinking. So the 58 Convention says, if you're going to have an enforceable award, it's based on a thing called the Principle of Comity. So the judges in one jurisdiction say, well, these guys in the other jurisdiction are also judges. They're a lot like us. There's brotherhood between all the people that are implementing law. And as a result, we will obey their guidance on what should happen locally, and we will obey their awards as if they were our awards. That system breaks down when you have judges in one jurisdiction having to deal with awards that were made by non-professional legal people in another jurisdiction. So somebody comes in with an arbitration award from a peer arbitrator and says, right, I want you to sell this guy's house and give me the proceeds. It's very plausible that somebody will simply say no, and at that point the peer arbitration system is dead because it's no longer enforceable. So if you want enforceability, you really have to use real arbitrators because you have no knowledge of when the peer arbitration system will simply stop working. So the approach that we take to this is building a thing called an automated title holder. So what an automated title holder is it's the bridge between the smart contracts and the legal world. And it operates by using a whole bunch of very cunning legal and smart contract engineering techniques to bind together an entity which to the court system appears to be a standard corporation and to the smart contract system appears to be a standard smart contract, and it does a whole bunch of very clever things internally to make sure that those illusions are never broken. So to the court system, it is a company. To the smart contract world, it is a smart contract, and it manages the matching of those two realities internally using a bunch of very clever pet tricks. And I'm going to explain a little more about how that works in a moment. Now, the point of this is that what we want here is an ultra-reliable counterparty for a smart contract. So if the idea here is that Ether comes in and then I give you a title deed to a house, the worst of all scenarios is that the Ether comes in and then the title deed for the house never comes out. Or it gets stuck in some kind of legal trap and it's stuck there for 6 months of litigation. We also don't want a situation where everything is resolved by escrow, because escrow is incredibly slow and expensive. It's a tax in the same way that an arbitration insurance scheme would be a tax. You can't run an economy with 100% escrow for everything. It's just too much friction. What you need is the ability to enforce award, and this is what we've built. So how does it work? Right? Here are all of the actors in the system that you actually wind up working with if you want to do this work. It's a big cast of characters. So you have the blockchain, you have private courts or arbitrators, You have the national courts. The national courts are in this scheme because the national court is what rules over the property in the system. If you want to do this with a house or a painting or something like that, all property recognized by the fiat court system has an owner. So if we want to transfer ownership, we have to do something that works from the perspective of the fiat courts, and that's why the fiat courts are in the picture. We're no longer in a situation where we've just got crypto assets. What we have is crypto assets on one hand and fiat assets on the other, and our job is to join that stuff together seamlessly. So we've got the smart contracts, we've got the automated title holder, which is this special kind of corporation. We have the asset title, which is basically an entry on a state ledger for the most part. Sellers, contract, buyer. So let's look at the first way of seeing this stuff. This is the wiring diagram of how all these things relate to each other in a fairly simplified way. Right? There are many different kinds of relationships between these entities. The particular magic happens in the places where you've got a single entity which has different kinds of lines coming into it. So if you look at the smart contract, for example, it has lines that come in from the contract. So the contract is talking to the smart contract. It also has lines that come in from Ethereum. So that's a place where the two worlds meet. You can see the same thing happens with the automated title holder. These are the places where the things cross over. Unfortunately, the blue lines and the purple lines come out almost identically on this projector, so you'll have to look carefully on that. Next time I will change the slide. Okay, so fiat property system. We all understand this. It's just buying and selling. So you have contracts, you have courts. There's no blockchain component there. Contracts go into title holders, which control titles. Government courts control the titles as well. And you just have the standard scheme where you register change with the land registry and everything updates. No news. The Ricardian Contract, this was invented by Ian Grigg back in the 90s. It's a paper contract that specifies an arbitrator and it specifies the behavior of a smart contract. If something goes wrong with the smart contract, the arbitrator has legal authority to go in and fix it because they're named in the original paper contract. This is the standard thing that everybody's using to get access to the real world. They're all over the blockchain space. Now we have the smart property. So this is the thing that Ethereum is doing. This is the clever part. So here we have a smart contract which is tied to an automated title holder, which is tied to asset title. So this is like the kind of enormously grown-up big brother version of the special purpose vehicle, which is what's used for doing things like real estate securitization. So in a special purpose vehicle, you put the property into a special purpose vehicle, a single purpose corporation, and the equity in that corporation gives you a partial ownership right of the underlying physical property. And that's all of the real estate tokenization stuff you hear about. It's running on that kind of template. The problem is that in that model, the link between the smart contract and the SPV is very weak, because it's not at all clear why it is that the shares from that SPV are represented by that specific ERC20 token. It's also not clear where these things would be exchanged, because at this point in history, there are no functioning securities exchanges. So there's a whole bunch of questions about the SPV as a way of approaching this, because the SPVs that we have were designed for interfacing with the ordinary banking system, where money comes in, but if something goes wrong, you've got the ability to reverse the payments, and there's no anonymous banking to speak of. When you take the regular SPV structure and you drop it into an environment that has non-repudiatable payments and things like Zcash and ZK Snarks kicking around, the normal SPV is no longer fit for purpose. It's just being dropped in deep into the 21st century without any updates, and it's only a matter of time until you wind up with security tokens which turn out not to be backed by any assets because somebody has stolen the assets out from under the security token and the token itself is worthless. Preventing that requires a really radical tightening of how the SPVs operate. Otherwise, you wind up with extremely hard payments going in one direction and squishy, vulnerable, attackable SPV tokens in the other direction. So this stuff is a real issue. So we have the smart contract, we have the automated title holder, we have the asset title. Now, what we're doing here is that we are joining the Ricardian contract that specifies what the parties want to happen to the automated title holder, which does the legal control of the assets. So an instruction is generated between the two parties, we make an agreement. I put my money into the smart contract as a payment in Ether or DAI or whatever it happens to be. The smart contract is read by the automated title holder systems, and then updates are made to the legal registers that control the assets. And what that allows us to do is essentially an atomic swap, where as soon as you see an update on the blockchain indicating that the contract has updated, you can be very nearly certain that you're now the legal asset, the legal owner of the thing that you bought, irrespected by the court in the jurisdiction of the asset. So this is the legal machinery that you need to be able to do things in the general format of sending Ether to a smart contract and receiving a villa in Brazil in payment. Right? It's actually the thing that you need to get all the way to the point where you can go car shopping with your phone, and there's a barcode on the car, and you take a picture of the barcode and it tells you how much it is, and you send a payment from your wallet and the system updates, and then you pick up the keys and you walk off the lot. Right? It's the machinery for doing that. Now, things like houses and cars exist on their own registers. They're a bit fiddly to do, so we're not starting with houses and cars this month. We're starting with common property, or what they call chattel property, movable property, it's another name for it, which is basically stuff like violins or cameras or just ordinary things. But that bridge, once it's built, every jurisdiction you operate in and every class of property you want to work with is just an extension to that bridge. So you start with the things which are easiest to do, and then you push forward until you do everything, and that's what we're doing. So that joining of the smart property, the Ricardian contract, as far as we know, that's never been done before. Right? This is the new thing. And the automated title holders are where the magic are. Right? The internal machinery which makes that possible is why we have taken so long to get Ethereum up to speed. That stuff is extremely subtle and very, very complex. As Mr. Ray has learned to say, everything simple is a lie. Right? There's no way to simplify the legal complexity in these systems, because if the legal system catches on something because there's some 1857 law that specifically applies to multi-occupancy flats which have had a flood as a result of the breach of a river caused by a sheep, it turns out that the legal world and your smart contract now deviate from each other, and there's no way back because the legal system will not respect a smart contract on its own. So, there's no way of doing this that is not about full respect of the complexity of the legal system. And the legal system is a sort of multi-thousand-year-old accumulation of human knowledge about everything that can go wrong when people make an agreement and then try and implement it. So there is no simplifying. It just has to be done the hard way. So what you can do with Ethereum is this, right? You bring us some assets, right? We start with common property in the UK. So you come to us with a bicycle or a camera or a $9 million Stradivarius violin. And you say, Ethereum, I would like to auction this for Ether or DAI, or I want to swap it for a CryptoKitty, but only a really good one. And we then work with you and probably your lawyers to figure out exactly what the paper contract will say under which you're going to sell this thing. Then a smart contract is prepared which implements the paper contract, and an automated rights holding entity will be created, or we'll use one or which we already have, and the property will be assigned to that entity. And once it's in that entity is the legal owner of it, and that entity can dispose of it by, for example, giving it to a new owner once the transaction is complete. And we can do this now. Right? It's still a bit manual, and there's a certain amount of handle turning to make it work. But in Q2, the violins will go online, and in Q3, with a little bit of luck, we'll start taking things out of industrial supply chains and putting them directly into these systems for use in trade finance. And then after that, it's just going to be a river, because everybody that wants to use smart contracts to control the real world is going to need these kinds of systems to be in play. And at this point, we're the only people in the world that know how to do this. I expect the techniques will spread, but not in a hurry, because everything simple is a lie. So we talked about the automated title holders, we talked about the SPVs, so I'm just going to skip forward on that. Property rails and payment rails. So what we are discussing here is the creation of something which is the counterparty to a payment rail. The payment rail is you use the blockchain to make a payment. The property rail is the thing that gives you the title to physical property on return. The outgoing rail is the payment, the return rail is the property rail. So what we're building is basically a property rail. How do we verify that the things we think are true are true? How do we get the goods into the system in the first place? How do we verify they aren't forgeries? The answer is insured oracles. Practically all of the places where facts go into the system, the fact comes in the form of an insurance contract, which is a consequential loss contract. In the event that we take these goods into the system on the basis that this is actually a 1955 classic Ford something or other, if it turns out to be a Fiat Pinto, somebody has to be legally on the hook for the damages that come out of that. And we don't think there's any other sensible way of getting facts into the blockchain. But the beauty of this is because it's an insurance system, if the stream of data coming into the blockchain is extremely reliable, then the cost of data will be very cheap. If you have an automated system, which is almost never wrong, and it just spits the data directly out into oracles, the insurance on those facts will be extremely inexpensive. If, on the other hand, you're an art historian and you have to do 2 months of research to figure out whether something is genuine or not, that's going to be a much more expensive process, and the insurance policy that you sell as part of that process will be correspondingly much more expensive. So what this provides is a single overarching architecture for getting facts into the blockchain in a way which can be used commercially. And that's very useful because it means that everybody's basically playing the same game, from people that have thermometers which are just constantly outputting what they think the temperature is, right the way through to people that are doing 6 months of analytics before they decide whether or not something is real, and then they're publishing the results. It provides a way for data providers to get paid, and it provides a way for data consumers to absolutely understand and limit their risk. The bigger picture on this is that what we're attempting to do here is do for matter what the internet did for data in the past 30 years. And I don't mean just the transmission of data, right? We can't physically transmit objects using the blockchain. We're going to have to wait for the physicists to catch up on that. But it's all the other stuff that we did to data or to information in the course of putting it online. The fact that every piece of information has a unique name, right? This clicker does not have a unique name. There's no serial number, there's no identity on this. If it's lost, there's no way of returning it to its owner, right? There's just no way of knowing what it is. If you have a name for things, there's lots of things you can do because now the objects are identifiable. And it's so much easier to talk about a particular film or a movie or a book or a poem that a friend wrote and stuck on a blog if you've got a unique name in the form of a URL than if you're just going through a description in a search engine. So the first thing is you get precise names for things out of this process. The second thing is that once you've got names for things, you can attach metadata to the names. Who owns it? Where did it come from? How much does it cost? If it's lost, how do I replace it? If it's broken, do I claim on my insurance or their insurance, or do I just take cash out of my pocket and give it to the front desk at reception? How does it work? So we can start instrumenting the world, so you can take out your smartphone and you can understand the rights that are attached to the objects which are around you. And that becomes very useful when you start thinking about renting things. All the sharing economy stuff that we talked about doing 10, 15 years ago, it never really took off except in a very centralized corporate form through things like Airbnb and Uber. It doesn't have to be that way, right? If you've got the ability to correctly connect physical assets to smart contracts, there's no reason that the sharing economy should be a centralized thing at all, and you can have single sharing economy backbones which carry all different kinds of sharing at the same time. You don't need one app per sharing thing. You could have a much more distributed ownership model. You could go through and spend 2 weeks tagging every single thing in your house, bind it all to smart contracts, and then immediately make all of it rentable. And then half of your stuff might wind up on the road, being carried by friends of yours who've rented it to go and do trips or play concerts or whatever they were going to do. There's an enormous amount of overuse of stuff in the physical world because we just don't have the architectures in place to do sharing or renting, particularly because we can't insure things. But if it's all bound into smart contracts, borrowing it, paying insurance, how to replace it and everything else will get bundled into a single transactional structure. So I think there's an enormous impact here for reducing the amount of material stuff that we all need to own while maintaining the same quality of life, and that reduces our ecological footprint. I think there's a huge game to be played there. So once we start thinking about this in terms of ecological impact, we can also start attaching metadata for things like carbon footprint directly to the objects that we're dealing with. So certifications that things are fair trade or slavery-free trade, a statement about carbon offsetting, all the rest of those kind of things can be tied directly to the asset passports, which means that you can then have policies like you will pay more to rent something if it's been carbon offset, or you won't buy anything that doesn't have a slave-free trade certification, and the underlying software that runs these systems can simply never show you something which doesn't meet your ethical standards. If you decide you're never going to buy anything that doesn't carry a slave-free trade certification, you can just instruct your software to never show you any offer that doesn't have that certification attached. So you can begin to automate your moral choices because your software can simply do the screening for you. You go to the preferences, you set your moral choices, you side your bars to whatever the settings you want are, and then it just screens the world out, so all the commerce which doesn't fit your ethical standards is never shown to you as a choice. The software will act on your behalf to protect you from your own laziness. I think that's hugely powerful. That's all, folks. On the next slide, I will show you where the meetup is if everyone wants to walk over there with me. If you want to know more about Ethereum, info@ethereum.com, send us an email, talk to us, tell us about the wonderful things we could do together. Ethereum.com/LP, the light paper, which is a really good description of what we're doing. It uses slightly different terminology from the terminology on the slides. We've made a couple of updates in the legal model in the last few months, so it needs a little bit of an update, but it's very conceptual about how the whole thing works. Expect actual, tangible, physical assets in Q2. Meetup directions are here. Thank you all very much. I don't have much time for questions because I meant to be at the meetup 5 minutes ago, but I'll take maybe one or two very quick ones. Okay. Very quick though, keep them short, because I really got to be somewhere else. Good. Yeah. Going once, going twice. Okay, yell. You have to shout. Would we consider this to be an alternative to Amazon? Maybe if we wind up with massively scalable blockchains and manufacturers tagging all of their goods at point of manufacture, but by then Amazon will probably be an asteroid mining company that has enormous robots that give you metals that fall from the sky on your coordinates. So, could you replicate Amazon with this kind of stuff? Certainly, but Amazon is not a static thing, it's a moving target. Another question, then we got a roll. Yes? Okay, so the assets still require, right? There's no way of doing this without giving the assets legal identity. In fact, this entire scheme is basically for giving assets legal identity. And that's done using this kind of insurance structure that we call asset passporting. Details are in the white paper. Gives you a lot of detail on that.
Is there any extra cost? Are you setting up a separate corporate vehicle for every asset class, or is it sort of just a generic one?
That is a very long and complicated question.
Good point.
So yeah, talk to me afterwards. Okay. Any burning, screaming questions? Okay, one more at the back, and then I'm out of here. Do it.
So, as like individual owners of an asset or a company with a product, the incentive to actually use this software, but you mentioned supply chain, and so I wonder what are the incentives for manufacturers to have supply chain exposed in this way?
Okay, so first thing is, in the age of things like snarks, using these kind of systems doesn't necessarily expose your supply chain as much as it would have, say, 2 or 3 years ago. So there is, firstly, a decent chance that you could do this in quite a private way. The second thing is that one of the groups that we're working with is a called FIMOSA, and it's the Union of Free and Special Economic Zones. And FIMOSA are very interested in what happens when you integrate trade finance, customs clearing, and logistics on a single chain. So you put all the stuff into the blockchain system, and then the same information, the same metadata about the object is used by the people who are lending, it's used by the people transporting, it's used by the customs agents, and that same data goes all the way through to secondary markets. So when you sell your laptop, the data trail goes all the way back to the factory, so you're not buying, for example, grey market knockoffs. I don't know whether consumer electronics is where that kind of transformation would start. I have a bit of a suspicion it might turn out to be something obnoxious like $35,000 handbags. But I think in the long run, the need for transparency down the supply chain is so strong, food safety, electronics, drug cloning, all the rest of that stuff, that I think it's very likely that we'll wind up with this kind of approach. I just don't know what combination of factors will push it over. But I think it's a combined thing. I think it's all of the different use cases on the same technology.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll see you all at the meetup. I'm going to basically gather a little crowd up there, and then we can all go over together. Thank you very much.